The stranger began to speak softly, not in performance, but in the simple language of humanity. He thanked the people for listening, for sharing their time, for being present in the square that evening. His voice was quiet, humble, but each word carried weight. The crowd leaned in instinctively, eager to catch every syllable, though the music had already said more than words ever could. There was no need for applause or fanfare. The acknowledgement came naturally. Through the shared understanding of what had been witnessed, people began to reflect on the evening. Some whispered about the lessons they were learning without realizing it. Humility, kindness, the power of art to connect strangers, and the importance of looking beyond appearances. The stranger's quiet presence and refusal to demand recognition became a mirror, showing them how often they had judged others superficially, and how much richness there was to discover in the lives of those around them. A man who had been skeptical earlier admitted to his companion, "I was wrong. I judged him without knowing anything. And I feel changed." The musician's actions had left a mark not only through the notes he played, but through the very way he lived in the moment. No one was demanding fame or acknowledgement. He played purely for connection. This authenticity resonated deeply, reminding the crowd that life's most profound experiences often come quietly, without pretense or expectation. Even the few who had remained doubtful or sarcastic were softened. Their attitudes shifted by the undeniable humanity in front of them. As the night deepened, the stranger began to pack up his belongings. His movements were calm, methodical, without rush or showiness. People moved closer instinctively, wanting to offer help, wanting to be part of the final moments of a night that had already become unforgettable. Yet he politely declined most assistance, maintaining the quiet dignity that had characterized his presence from the start. The crowd understood that his journey was personal, and that what he offered was not transactional but heartfelt. They respected him all the more for it. A few journalists and photographers, now aware of his identity, approached carefully. They sought to document the event, to capture the story. But the stranger remained focused on the human aspect rather than fame or publicity. He answered their questions briefly, with honesty and simplicity, emphasizing the importance of music as a bridge between people rather than a source of recognition or wealth. The reporters left with a new story to tell, one that went beyond the usual headlines. Carrying a message of humility, connection, and authenticity, the square gradually emptied. But the impression of the evening lingered in the hearts of everyone present. The stranger had become a symbol not just of musical talent, but of the quiet, profound strength that comes from living authentically. People whispered to one another about what they had experienced, replaying the music in their minds, recalling the subtle gestures and quiet moments that had made the evening extraordinary. Even as they returned to their routines, the memory of the stranger and his piano remained, a reminder of the unexpected beauty that life can offer. One young man stayed behind a little longer, watching as the stranger walked away, fading into the dimly lit streets. He realized that this encounter had changed his perspective on how he viewed others, how he judged, and how he appreciated the small, human moments that often go unnoticed. The music, combined with the revelation of the pianist's identity, had created an experience that was both personal and universal. It reminded him, and everyone who had been there, that greatness can be quiet and that true value is often hidden beneath the surface. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying with it the distant sounds of the city. But for those who had witnessed the performance, a sense of warmth lingered, a warmth that came from shared understanding, humility, and the unexpected generosity of someone who had chosen to give without expectation. The piano, now silent, remained in the square, a symbol of the evening's lessons and memories, waiting perhaps for the next soul to recognize its power. The experience left a lasting impression, not because of spectacle, but because of authenticity, humanity, and the quiet, transformative power of music. Nearby, some of the onlookers sensed the tension and turned to see what was happening. A few curious whispers started spreading through the crowd, but no one could guess the truth. Then, almost simultaneously, several people recognized subtle hints in the stranger's posture. It's the way his fingers moved, the grace in his hands. They leaned forward, whispering excitedly, trying to piece together what they were seeing. Wait, isn't that? Could it be him? It became clear, in small, stunned fragments, that the stranger was no ordinary street musician. He was someone who had once been known far and wide, someone whose music had been celebrated in concert halls and broadcast across countries. Years ago, he had been a sensation, a rising star, but then he disappeared from the public eye. No one had known why. And now, standing there in tattered clothing playing for food, he had returned, but not in the way anyone expected. The crowd grew stiller, and whispers gave way to stunned silence. A woman stepped closer, hand over her mouth, tears beginning to form. "It's him," she whispered. "It's really him." Children who had been playing near the edges of the square stopped, sensing the change in mood, while parents held them closer, marveling at the revelation. Even the skeptics who had doubted him earlier were frozen, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. The quiet, modest stranger in front of them was a once famous pianist, a living legend of music, now playing for nothing more than a humble meal. The older gentleman, who had first recognized him, finally spoke to the crowd, his voice shaky but clear. This is the pianist everyone thought had vanished, the one who left fame behind. Right here." Gasps spread through the square, followed by murmurs of astonishment. Phones came out, and people whispered into them, sharing the unbelievable news. Social media would later be flooded with posts, videos, and disbelief. But in this moment, everyone was focused on the stranger who continued to sit quietly at the piano. Unaware that his identity had been discovered, the revelation added a new layer to the music they had heard. People realized that the passion and depth they felt in the melody came from a life rich with experience, with triumphs, loss, and personal choices that had led him here. The audience could sense the story behind the notes, the struggle, the decision to leave fame, the quiet strength that allowed him to create something so powerful without expectation. The music had been a mirror of the person behind it, and now they understood why it had been so moving. A few people approached cautiously, hoping to speak, to touch the legend, to confirm that he was real. The stranger looked up for the first time, eyes meeting the faces around him. There was no surprise in his expression, no need to perform for recognition. He simply acknowledged them with a faint smile, a quiet presence that reinforced the authenticity of the moment. The people who had mocked him before now felt a mixture of shame and awe. They had judged him by his appearance, by his circumstance, and not by the artistry and humanity he carried. And now they could see the truth. It's undeniable and humbling. The square had transformed into a stage, not by intention, but by recognition. The stranger's quiet humility became part of the story, his refusal to demand attention, adding weight to the awe around him. A young girl whispered to her mother, "Mom, why would someone so good play here for food?" The mother hugged her closer, speaking softly, "Sometimes people give what they love, not what they are owed." This is one of those moments. A journalist in the crowd, having recognized him from his past fame, frantically typed notes into a small tablet, capturing the unfolding story. Her colleagues called in to verify, and soon a few more journalists arrived, drawn by the whispers of the crowd. Cameras were raised, but the stranger did not stop or change his demeanor. He remained himself, playing quietly, letting the music speak more than the words ever could. The revelation brought a wave of emotions over the audience. Awe, disbelief, admiration, and a hint of envy mixed together. People who had dismissed him earlier now found themselves humbled by the realization of who he was. Some knelt or bowed their heads slightly in respect, not fully knowing why, only feeling the weight of witnessing something rare and human. Others stood frozen, overwhelmed by the combination of musical talent, humility, and unexpected revelation. For a moment there was stillness, as if the entire square was holding its breath. The stranger rose slightly, acknowledging the crowd with a subtle nod. But his focus remained on the piano, on the music, on the simple act of creation. There was no arrogance, no desire for accolades, only a quiet presence that spoke louder than any words could. The people around him, now aware of his identity, could feel the depth of every note, understanding that the beauty they had experienced was inseparable from the life that had shaped it. The older gentleman, who had first recognized him, approached carefully, holding a small notebook. He extended it without a word, hoping for an autograph. The stranger looked at the book, smiled faintly, and signed it quickly, almost distractedly, then returned to the piano. The crowd watched this small interaction, sensing the humility in the gesture, the simplicity in the life he now led. Fame had not changed him. It had only refined the depth of what he offered, and it was evident in the music and the quiet way he moved through the world. As the evening deepened, more people joined, drawn not just by the music, but by the story that had emerged. The square, which had been bustling with ordinary evening life, had become a place of quiet reverence. The stranger's music, combined with the revelation of his identity, transformed the crowd. People no longer moved hurriedly. They lingered, observing, listening, absorbing the rare and unexpected presence of a legend in such humble circumstances. The twist in the story, the realization that someone who had once stood on grand stages and commanded audiences worldwide now chose to play in a public square for food, left everyone in awe. There were tears, quiet murmurs, and stunned silence. As the crowd processed the contrast between fame and humility, recognition and anonymity, past glory and present simplicity, people who had doubted him earlier now understood that life had guided him here, and the beauty of the moment was amplified by the unexpected truth of who he was, even the smallest gestures, the slight smile to those offering food, the gentle nod to the crowd, the quiet acknowledgement of recognition carried weight. People realized that the stranger had chosen this path intentionally, that his presence, music, and humility were all part of a story that transcended expectation. The lesson was clear. Appearances can be deceiving, and true greatness does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, humbly, and leaves a mark far deeper than spectacle ever could. As the night continued, the stranger finally paused, letting the silence settle over the square. The audience remained, not wanting to break the connection, not wanting to let the spell fade too quickly. The realization of who he was had shifted everything. Doubt had turned to admiration, mockery to humility, and curiosity to awe. The twist had made the music even more profound, and the people who witnessed it would carry the memory of this night for the rest of their lives. A reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary moments come from the most unexpected places. The night had fully settled over the city square, and the lights cast a gentle glow on the faces of the crowd. The stranger stood quietly beside the piano, the worn bag resting over his shoulder. He had finished playing for the evening, yet no one moved immediately, as if time itself had paused to honor the moment. The realization of who he was, combined with the beauty of the music, had left everyone stunned, thoughtful, and deeply moved. A few people approached hesitantly, offering sandwiches, fruits, and other small tokens of kindness. The stranger accepted them with a calm nod, expressing gratitude without words. Each small gift felt like a bridge, connecting him with the people who had been touched by his music. There were no grand gestures, no demands for recognition, only a quiet, humble acceptance that made those offering their kindness feel seen and appreciated. Among the crowd, whispers circulated about what had just happened. Conversations began slowly, softly, filled with awe and disbelief. People who had mocked him earlier now felt a mixture of shame and admiration. They shared their experiences with each other, describing how the music had touched them personally, how the melody seemed to speak directly to their hearts. A young woman, holding her child, whispered to the person beside her, "I didn't expect to feel this way. I didn't think someone like him would be here, playing just for food." The sentiment was echoed across the square by many, each in their own way, grappling with the unexpected reality. Some of the children in the audience, previously distracted by their own games, now sat quietly on the ground, listening with wide eyes. Even the parents, standing nearby, found themselves unusually silent, absorbed by the presence of the stranger and the resonance of his music in their own hearts. The simplicity of the moment, the absence of any pretense, created a powerful connection between the musician and those who had gathered to witness him. A group of teenagers, who had earlier questioned his skill, now watched in quiet fascination. One whispered, "It's beautiful." His friend nodded, silent, caught in a strange mixture of disbelief and wonder. Across the square, a woman adjusted her scarf, tears welling up in her eyes despite herself. She did not know why she felt such emotion, only that she did. The music seemed to peel back layers of everyday life, revealing something pure and human beneath. A man sitting on the steps shifted, closing his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. He felt memories he had long buried, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed lighter. Even the mockers from before had softened. The whispers of jokes and disbelief faded into silence as the music took hold. A few exchanged glances, realizing they had underestimated the stranger entirely. One woman muttered to her companion, "He's incredible." The companion, who had scoffed earlier, could only nod, eyes wide, captivated by what he had once dismissed. The piano was no longer a simple instrument in a city square. It had become a vessel for emotion, a bridge between strangers. A quiet miracle unfolding in front of everyone who cared to notice. The stranger's melody grew richer, more complex, yet it retained a simplicity that made it accessible to all. Each chord resonated, each pause intentional. A young boy with a notebook mimicked the movements of the hands he could not touch, his pencil dancing across the page as he tried to capture the magic. Beside him, his mother watched, impressed by the boy's focus and by the music that inspired such attention. A few others pulled out phones, recording snippets, not for social media, but to remember the moment, to hold on to the rare beauty that had entered their lives unexpectedly. The air around the piano changed. The bustling city noise seemed to fade, replaced by a calm stillness that made people forget their routines, their worries, their deadlines. Even the wind seemed gentler, carrying the notes through the square, stirring a sense of serenity that no one anticipated. A woman sitting on a bench closed her eyes, letting the sound envelop her. The music felt alive, almost breathing, telling stories she could not name, but somehow understood. She glanced around, seeing others caught in the same spell. Realizing that the connection was collective, yet deeply personal, a man walking his dog slowed his pace, unsure whether to stop or keep moving. The dog seemed to sense the change as well, quieting beside him. The man hesitated, then decided to stay, leaning against a lamppost, captivated by the performance. Another passerby, a young woman with headphones, had removed them completely, allowing the music to enter her world unfiltered. She tilted her head slightly, smiling, as though the stranger's playing had unlocked something she'd forgotten existed. Even a street vendor nearby paused, setting down a tray of pastries to watch, letting the music fill the gaps between his thoughts. The stranger's focus never wavered. He was immersed, as if the square, the crowd, and the piano were all part of him. Each note carried intention, each pause allowed reflection. The melody was not loud nor demanding. It simply existed. Yet it had a force that could not be ignored. People felt it in their bones, in their chest, in the corners of their minds they had long neglected. The piano was no longer just an object. It was a storyteller, a healer, a witness to the humanity gathered around it. A few skeptics tried to maintain their distance, but even they could not escape the pull. One man whispered to his companion, "I didn't think it could be like this." His friend nodded, jaw tight, realizing the truth in the music's quiet power. Others had stopped whispering entirely, drawn into the melody, letting it speak for itself. The square was transformed. What had started as casual curiosity and mild mockery had shifted into shared attention, an unspoken agreement to respect and witness the moment fully. The melody began to swell, carrying a mixture of melancholy and hope. The notes spoke of struggle, perseverance, and quiet triumph. People found themselves relating, imagining their own stories in the music, seeing fragments of their own lives reflected in the stranger's playing. An older woman sitting nearby felt tears prick at her eyes. She remembered lost opportunities, old friends, and distant family. And yet the music comforted her, reminding her that beauty could still exist in unexpected places. A young man standing in the back realized he had been too quick to judge, Life often hid surprises behind ordinary appearances, the stranger continued, unbothered by the growing crowd or their reactions. He played for the music itself, for the connection it created, for the fleeting moments of recognition in the faces around him. Each person in the audience felt that they were being spoken to, not singled out, but included, embraced by something larger than themselves. Even those who had doubted found themselves swayed, caught in a current of emotion that no words could capture. The square, once a place of rush and noise, had become a sanctuary for reflection, a space where music bridged gaps between strangers, uniting them in a quiet, profound way. As the melody reached its most emotional peak, a hush fell over the crowd. People leaned forward slightly, caught in the gravity of the moment. Some held their breath, others closed their eyes, letting the music penetrate deeper. A young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mom, he's amazing." "Ah!" The mother nodded, unable to speak, feeling the same truth. Across the square, a man adjusted his glasses. Realizing that the performance was no longer about skill or food, it was about connection, its understanding, and shared humanity. The music had transcended expectations, silencing doubts and mocking whispers. Replacing them with awe and respect, the notes softened gradually, creating a gentle fade that left a lingering warmth in the air. People remained still, reluctant to break the spell, savoring the final moments. The stranger's hands hovered briefly over the keys, as if acknowledging the end of a chapter, before resting gently on the piano. He opened his eyes, meeting the faces around him for the first time fully. There were smiles, nods, and even a few tears, all unspoken expressions of gratitude and awe. The performance had reached far beyond what anyone had expected, touching hearts and changing perceptions with nothing more than honesty and skill. As people began to stir, whispering softly among themselves, a sense of shared wonder remained. The square, once ordinary and bustling, had become a place of quiet reverence. The stranger had not sought attention or praise, yet he had commanded it in the most profound way possible. Those who had doubted, mocked, or ignored him now carried a new understanding, that true talent, paired with authenticity, could shift perspectives, stir emotions, and leave an indelible mark. The music had become more than sound. It had become an experience, a reminder of humanity's capacity for empathy, connection, an appreciation of the unexpected. The stranger's gaze swept over the crowd one last time before he slowly stood, adjusting his worn bag. The piano remained quiet, as if resting after its revelation. People lingered, reluctant to leave, reflecting on what they had witnessed. The air was thick with unspoken admiration, with newfound respect, and with the realization that something extraordinary had just occurred in the middle of an ordinary city square. And though the stranger had not spoken a word, his music had told a story that everyone understood, a story of humanity, of connection, and of the quiet power of someone who simply chose to share their gift without expectation. As the final notes of the melody lingered in the evening air, the square fell into a quiet hush. People blinked, as if waking from a spell, slowly realizing they had been part of something extraordinary. The stranger sat for a moment, hands resting lightly on the keys, his gaze calm yet reflective. The audience remained silent, caught between disbelief and admiration, some unsure if they should speak or move. Not wanting to disturb the magic that had just unfolded, a woman stepped forward cautiously, offering a sandwich. The stranger nodded gently, accepting it with a small smile. He did not speak, but the gesture felt intimate, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection he had created without words. Nearby, a man who had earlier been skeptical muttered to himself, "I can't believe it. This was real." His voice trembled slightly, and the companion beside him shook his head in silent agreement. The performance had revealed something they had not expected: skill, emotion, and humility, all intertwined in one person. Then, as the crowd began to murmur softly among themselves, one older gentleman in the audience froze. His eyes widened, and he stepped back slightly, gripping his cane a little tighter. A faint recognition crossed his face, a mix of shock and disbelief. He whispered under his breath, "Could it really be?" People around him noticed the sudden change in his demeanor. They looked at him curiously, unsure what had caused it. The older man moved closer, his steps slow but deliberate, as though drawn by an unseen force. The stranger, still seated at the piano, continued to rest his hands lightly on the keys. Unaware that the perception of the crowd was about to shift dramatically, the older man's gaze locked on the stranger. And suddenly, a realization dawned. He reached for his phone, fumbled briefly, and dialed quickly. His voice was low but urgent as he spoke into the receiver. The words were clipped, almost incredulous. "I'm here. I think he's right in front of me. I can't believe it." Woman, carrying groceries, stopped near the edge of the crowd. She had initially ignored the music, thinking it was just another street performer. But something about the sound made her pause. She held her bags tightly, listening to the melody that felt so personal, so full of emotion, that she couldn't help but watch the stranger's fingers dance across the keys. Despite the whispers and occasional mockery, a few people were genuinely moved. An elderly man sitting on a bench watched silently, his cane resting against his leg. His eyes were soft, and there was a faint smile on his lips. He could feel the honesty in the music, the way it seemed to speak directly to him. A mother with a toddler held the child close, allowing the little one to hear the sounds. Even the child seemed captivated, his wide eyes reflecting the gentle rhythm of the piano. The stranger did not look at the audience. He did not need to. His music was enough to connect with them without a single word. Not everyone appreciated the moment, however. A group of young professionals leaned against a railing, arms folded, whispering critiques. "It's just a piano," one said. "Anyone could play like that." Other rolled her eyes, adding, "Yeah, but why here? Why play for food?" Their voices carried a sense of superiority, a belief that skill was meaningless unless flaunted in the right places. Yet even as they doubted him, their eyes occasionally flicked to the keys, betraying a reluctant curiosity. The stranger noticed nothing of their judgments. He played with care, each note intentional, carrying a quiet dignity that no mockery could touch. A restaurant manager, standing just outside the square, frowned as he watched the crowd swell. He was concerned that the growing audience might disturb his patrons or block the walkway. He debated whether to approach the stranger, perhaps to ask him to leave, but hesitated. There was something different about this musician. The manager could see the calm in his posture, the focus in his eyes. It was not desperation or begging. It was something else entirely. He shifted his weight, unsure if he should intervene or simply watch from a distance. Meanwhile, the stranger's music began to change subtly. The notes became deeper, richer, more expressive. There was a quiet intensity now, as if he were telling a story that only he could understand. The people who had mocked him earlier stopped their whispers, unconsciously drawn into the unfolding melody. A few even found themselves holding their breath, caught in a moment they hadn't expected. The music moved through the square like a gentle wave, soft yet insistent, and those who listened closely could feel the emotion behind each key. A young man with a sketch pad, previously passing by, now crouched on the ground to capture the scene. He sketched quickly, trying to match the rhythm of the music with the motion of his pencil. Beside him, a woman paused her phone call, listening, her expression softening. It was as if the music demanded attention without asking for it. Reaching into the hearts of those who had been skeptical or hurried, even the wind seemed to slow, carrying the notes through the square in a way that made people stop, just for a moment, to breathe and observe. A small child tugged at her mother's hand, pointing excitedly at the piano. "Mom, he's so good," she exclaimed. The mother smiled, letting herself be pulled closer, and for the first time in hours, she felt a sense of calm. Other onlookers, previously dismissive, began to notice the subtle beauty in the performance. A teenager, still doubtful, whispered to his friend, I think he's amazing." His friend, reluctantly nodding, agreed, though neither spoke above a whisper. The air around the piano had shifted. It was no longer just a stranger playing for food. It had become an unexpected center of attention, a quiet stage for something truly moving. Some people still doubted. A couple walking briskly through the square muttered complaints about the noise. A man on a bicycle slowed but continued pedaling, glancing over his shoulder briefly, unsure if he should stop or not. Yet even their fleeting attention was captured, even if just for a heartbeat, by the sincerity in the music. The stranger's calm persistence made the critics pause, if only unconsciously, and notice that this was not ordinary. He played not to impress, not to demand recognition, but because he had to, because it was part of him. A few more people offered small contributions, sandwiches, coins, or a simple nod of respect. The stranger accepted the food with a quiet grace, not making it a performance or demanding gratitude. He smiled faintly at those who reached out, acknowledging their kindness before returning to the piano. Each gesture was minimal, yet it added to the growing sense that this was a genuine moment, unscripted and real. Those who had paused earlier now lingered longer, drawn in by the authenticity of the scene. As the shadows lengthened and the evening grew cooler, the crowd settled into an uneasy mixture of admiration and disbelief. Whispers of surprise, awe, and even shame floated through the square. People began to share their observations quietly, pointing out the skill in his hands, the depth in the music, the courage in his humility. Some laughed nervously at their earlier judgments, realizing they had misread the stranger entirely. Others simply stood silently. Caught in the delicate tension between disbelief and admiration, the stranger's fingers moved with steady confidence, yet always gentle. He didn't rush, didn't show off, and didn't seek approval. The notes carried a story, though no one yet understood what it was. Some people speculated among themselves, imagining tales of hardship or hidden talent, someone who had once played for large audiences but now chose this quiet life. Even as mockery faded into the background, curiosity grew, mingled with a sense of awe. The stranger's music created a bridge between the hurried passers-by and the moment they were sharing. A small oasis in the middle of the busy city. A few observers, previously dismissive, now felt a pang of guilt for their early judgments. They had assumed they knew the stranger's story, that they could measure his worth by his appearance or situation. But now, hearing the music and watching the focus and skill in his hands, they realized how wrong they had been. The simple act of playing a piano for food had become a lesson, a reminder that value cannot always be measured by outward appearances. The sun disappeared completely behind the buildings, and the city lights began to flicker on. The piano's notes carried on, echoing softly in the evening air. The stranger continued to play, completely absorbed in the music, unaware of the transformations happening around him. The mockers had quieted, the curious had leaned in closer, and the skeptical had softened, if only a little. For those who had paused, this was no longer just a performance. It had become a shared human experience, a fleeting moment of connection in an otherwise rushed and disconnected world. By the time the evening was fully upon the square, a small group remained, standing quietly. Captivated by the music, the stranger played with a gentle intensity, each note resonating as if telling a story to each listener individually. The tension between doubt and admiration had shifted entirely. The music was no longer background noise. It was a message, a presence, a force that could not be ignored. And though most of the crowd had arrived without expectation, they were leaving with something far more profound than they could have imagined. A quiet awareness of beauty, skill, and the simple power of human expression. The evening had settled into a quiet rhythm, but the square was no longer the same. The stranger's music had changed, becoming deeper and more expressive, reaching into corners of the crowd that no one had expected. The notes carried emotion, a mixture of sadness and hope, of memories and dreams, that seemed to touch each listener personally. People who had arrived reluctantly or out of passing curiosity found themselves standing still, unable to move. Their feet were rooted to the ground, their eyes drawn to the piano and the figure behind it. A man with a briefcase had paused earlier, skeptical, but now he could not look away. Each note seemed to echo through him, stirring something he had not felt in years. He looked at the stranger, seeing not a beggar or a street performer, but someone who had a story to tell without saying a single word. Across the square, a mother held her child closer, the child's small fingers curling around hers, as if the music had captured even the innocence of youth. She realized that the melody was telling a story of life itself, full of ups and downs, of quiet victories and hidden sorrows. The stranger's hands moved with a quiet intensity. His eyes closed, his fingers gliding across the keys effortlessly, yet with a deliberate gentleness. He did not rush. Every note was measured, carrying weight beyond its sound. People began to lean in, some whispering in awe, others simply breathing in the music without words. Even the occasional skeptic could feel it, the honesty, the depth, the raw emotion that had no need for explanation. The music was speaking directly to them, bypassing language, connecting heart to heart. The sun had started to dip behind the tall buildings, casting long shadows over the city square. People walked quickly, carrying bags, briefcases, or groceries, heads down, eyes focused on their own path. Among them, a stranger moved slowly, almost like he was in a different world. He had a worn bag slung over his shoulder, and his clothes were simple, a little too old for the bustling city. There was something about him that made him easy to ignore. Yet he seemed completely at ease with being invisible. At the edge of the square, an old piano sat under a small canopy. Slightly out of tune, the wood scratched and faded. It had clearly been there for a long time, a forgotten piece of art waiting for someone to notice it. A small sign leaned against the piano, written in simple words, "I play for food." Most people glanced at it and then walked on, not giving it a second thought. But the stranger stopped. He set down his bag carefully, almost like he was greeting an old friend. He looked around briefly, checking the passers-by, and then ran his hands lightly over the keys. The sound was soft at first, hesitant, almost shy. A few people slowed down to look, curious, but not expecting much. A woman with shopping bags shook her head and laughed quietly to her friend, thinking it was some kind of joke. A man in a suit muttered under his breath, wondering why anyone would bother with such an old, out-of-tune piano in a busy place. The stranger did not seem to notice any of it. His eyes closed briefly as he let his fingers find the keys. The notes were simple, not complicated, almost like a gentle greeting. The music blended with the ambient noise of the city footsteps. Distant car horns, laughter from children, but there was a quiet warmth in it that made a few people pause longer than they intended. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing at the piano, and she glanced down with a small smile, nodding. Even the mother's eyes softened for a moment, caught by the unexpected sound. Despite the few who noticed, most people still hurried past, not giving the stranger a second thought. He began to play a little louder, but still gentle, careful. The sound was steady, calm, and for those who stopped even briefly, there was a sense that something real was happening here, something human. A man sitting on a nearby bench with a cup of coffee raised his eyebrows, not sure why he had stopped, but glad he had. A teenager with headphones paused, pulled one earbud out, and turned to watch. His curiosity piqued. The stranger did not speak. He had no case open for money, no sign asking for attention, just the small note about food. His focus was entirely on the piano, on the music he was coaxing from it. The notes were simple, but there was a quiet honesty in the way they were played, a story that no one had yet figured out. Each key pressed seemed to carry a memory, a feeling, a hope. He played like he had been playing for years, and every sound was intentional, even if no one knew the story behind it. A young woman stopped with her dog, letting the leash slack in her hand. She tilted her head as she listened, curious. There was something in the music that made her heart feel lighter, though she couldn't explain why. She watched as the stranger's fingers moved with confidence, yet with a gentle humility. It was strange to see someone so focused on creating something beautiful without expecting applause or reward. She glanced at the small sign again and shook her head in disbelief. A pianist of this skill, playing just for food? She had never seen anything like it, the stranger continued, occasionally glancing up to make sure no one was in immediate need of help, though he never broke his rhythm. He played not for recognition, but because he needed to, because the music was part of him. The people who paused felt a subtle pull, as if the music reached into the corners of their minds, reminding them of moments long past, of feelings they had almost forgotten. A man walking his child slowed, and for a brief moment, the world outside the music, the cars, the buildings. The hurry seemed to fade away. Some mocked quietly, whispering to friends or family, not wanting to be part of the scene. But even their laughter faltered when they heard the sincerity in the sound. There was no showmanship, no attempt to impress anyone. Yet the piano spoke in a way that made the busy square momentarily still. A few people stopped, unsure if they should linger or continue on their way. There was a pause in the chaos, a space where the stranger's music created a gentle calm. He played for several minutes, each note deliberate, almost like a conversation without words. He did not ask for attention. He simply shared what he had. The smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery mixed with the faint scent of rain lingering in the air. The music seemed to fit the scene perfectly, as if it belonged there more than anything else. A small group gathered silently, some sitting on the steps, others standing at the edge, just listening. Their faces showed curiosity, but more than that, a quiet respect. Even if they did not know why, the stranger's hands moved fluidly, yet not quickly. There was no rush in his playing, no need to prove anything. Each note seemed to matter, carrying a weight that only someone who had lived through much could convey. A homeless man sitting nearby, unnoticed until now, looked up from his newspaper. He hadn't expected anyone to see him, yet the music touched him, and he gave a small nod of appreciation. The stranger noticed him for a moment and smiled faintly before returning to the piano. Unaffected by the size of the audience, people began to whisper among themselves, surprised by how good he was. Some pulled out their phones to record, while others simply stood in silence, letting the music wash over them. A young boy mimicked the stranger's hand movements with his fingers, trying to imagine himself playing like that one day. The stranger's gaze occasionally swept over the crowd, calm and observant, but always returning to the keys. He seemed to be playing not just for the few who watched, but for the entire world passing by, a fleeting audience of strangers. The city square, usually loud and full of motion, felt different now. There was a softness in the air, a stillness that made people take a deep breath without realizing it. The stranger's music didn't demand attention, it invited it gently, without force. The few who had stopped felt a strange connection, shared experience with someone they didn't know, someone they might never see again. Time passed, and the shadows grew longer. The stranger's performance continued, simple yet moving, honest in every sense. He did not glance at the small offerings of food left by a few generous onlookers. He acknowledged them with a nod or a soft smile, never taking more than he needed. The act was humble, pure, and somehow magnetic. Those who watched could feel it. This was not a performance for fame or recognition. This was someone sharing his soul, and it touched people in ways words never could. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the buildings, the crowd that had gathered slowly began to disperse, but many lingered just a little longer. No one spoke above a whisper, as if not wanting to disturb the magic of the moment. The stranger finally leaned back slightly, hands resting on the keys, eyes opening for the first time to meet the faces around him. There were smiles, nods, a few expressions of awe. But most importantly, there was a sense that everyone who had stopped, even briefly, had witnessed something real and human. The stranger stood, picked up his worn bag, and gave a small bow to the emptying square. He did not ask for anything, did not speak a word, and slowly walked away. The piano remained quiet and still, but it was no longer forgotten. The music lingered in the hearts of those who had paused, a gentle reminder that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can leave the deepest mark. And so, as people returned to their hurried lives, a few glanced back at the piano, wondering if they had imagined it, if it had all been real. But deep down, they knew the music had been real, and so had the stranger. The crowd that had slowly gathered around the piano began to grow, though not everyone had stopped for admiration. Many still passed by, glancing briefly at the stranger as if he were part of the background. A few whispered to each other, some clearly mocking the idea that someone could be so talented and yet play for food. They laughed softly, thinking it was a trick or a joke. And some even exchanged skeptical glances, questioning why anyone would pause for a street musician who offered nothing more than a humble meal in return. The stranger remained unaware of most of this, focused entirely on the piano. His hands moved with precision, every note deliberate, creating a soft melody that drifted through the square. One man, in a crisp business suit, stopped for a moment, glanced down at his watch and shook his head. He muttered something to the woman beside him, his tone tinged with disbelief. "Why waste time on that?" asked. The woman smirked, adjusting her scarf. "Maybe it's a scam," she replied. A young man nearby leaned against a pillar, arms crossed, and snorted, clearly unimpressed. Yet, even as they whispered and laughed, their ears betrayed them, catching bits of the music that seemed to carry a quiet elegance, a subtle beauty that contrasted sharply with the hurried life around them. A small group of teenagers lingered, curiosity mixed with disbelief. One of them nudged his friend and whispered, "Do you hear that?"
Nice.
"Actually good." His friend rolled his eyes, not fully convinced, but they stayed, drawn in despite their skepticism. Another.